In the cold, damp hours of March 24th, 1603, Richmond Palace held its breath. The air inside the royal chambers was thick with the scent of burning herbs and the heavy weight of an era coming to an end. The Queen was dead. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, the woman who had transformed England into a global power, lay silent on a bed of velvet and lace. But as the ladies of the bedchamber began the final sacred ritual of washing her body, they stumbled upon a forbidden secret that had been buried for 60 years. This was a betrayal of the crown. It was a lie that had sustained an empire and a curse that would have changed the world if it had ever been whispered outside these stone walls. They looked upon a body that did not match the history books. They saw a truth that made every law, every execution, and every royal decree of the last half-century a total and absolute deception. In that moment, they realized the woman on the throne was not the girl born to the blood of Henry VIII. This is the truth the king buried. Now let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air as we travel back to a time when the world was younger and far more dangerous. We move away from the dying queen and back to the summer of 1542. Imagine the rolling hills of the Cotswolds and a small isolated village called Bisley. The air here is fresh and carries the smell of wild lavender. It is a place of peace, but for a young princess named Elizabeth, it was meant to be a place of refuge that turned into a place of shadows. To understand the secret of the golden mask, we must understand the pressure of the Tudor bloodline. In the 16th century, a royal body was not just flesh and bone. It was a vessel for the state. If the body was flawed, the state was flawed. If the blood was common, the crown was hollow. Elizabeth was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom Henry VIII had broken the world and the church. From the moment she was born, Elizabeth was surrounded by eyes that wanted to see her fail. She was a pawn in a game of survival. But in that summer of 1542, a sudden and violent fever swept through the countryside. The young princess, only 9 years old, was sent to Bisley to escape the sweating sickness that was ravaging London. She was accompanied by a small group of loyal servants and her governess, Ashley. They believed the country air would save her. But history has a way of hiding its most painful moments in the quietest places. The fever did not stay in London. It followed the princess to the hills. Within days, the young Elizabeth was burning with a heat that no cold cloth could break. The records of that time are thin, and some say they were intentionally scrubbed clean. But the legend of the Bisley Boy suggests that on one Tuesday evening, as the sun set over the stone cottages, the Tudor princess took her final breath. Imagine the sheer terror that gripped Ashley. To lose a royal child under your care was not just a failure. It was a death sentence. Henry VIII was a man of legendary rage. If he were to find out his daughter had died in a dusty village because of a fever, he would have had the heads of every servant in that house. The governess looked at the small, pale body and knew that her life ended that night unless she could do something impossible. She needed to present a living Elizabeth to the king when he arrived for his scheduled visit. Just days later, the search began in secret. They could not look in the local manors or the homes of the wealthy. They needed a child who was the right age, the right height, and possessed the same red-gold hair as the princess. But in a village as small as Bisley, there were few options. As the story goes, they found only one child who could fit the description. But there was a problem that would define the next 60 years of English history. The child was not a girl. The child found in the village was a young boy. He was thin and pale with features that were strikingly similar to the Tudor family. In the desperation of that night, the servants dressed him in the royal silks of the princess. They covered his head with a hood and coached him in the soft manners of a royal. When King Henry arrived, he did not suspect a thing. He was a father who had seen his children rarely, and he was a king who saw what he wanted to see. He saw a child who was shy and quiet, which was explained away as the lingering effects of the fever, but as the years passed, the shy child grew into a teenager. And as puberty began to change the bodies of other girls, Elizabeth remained different. This is where the historical information becomes fascinating for a modern audience. Historians have long noted that Elizabeth I was famous for her refusal to ever see a doctor. Even when she was gravely ill, she would not allow the royal physicians to touch her skin or examine her body. She was known to have a deep and irrational fear of being seen without her heavy velvet robes and her high lace collars. Was this merely the modesty of a virgin queen, or was it the calculated survival of a boy playing the part of a woman? Think about the heavy lead-based makeup that Elizabeth became famous for later in her life. It was a mask of white paste that grew thicker every year. We are told she used it to hide the scars of smallpox. But consider the possibility that the mask was used to hide the growing masculine features of a man who was aging into a role he never chose. The strong jawline, the deepening voice, and the lack of a traditional female silhouette were all hidden under layers of silk and white lead. The psychological layer of this story is profound. Imagine living every second of your life knowing that one single mistake or one stray touch could lead to the collapse of an entire nation. The boy from Bisley had to learn not just how to speak like a princess, but how to think like one. He had to study the languages, the philosophy, and the theology that the real Elizabeth would have known. He became a scholar of deception. He became so good at the role that the mask and the person became one dot in the tier 1 countries of the modern world. We often talk about identity and the roles we play. But for the person on the Tudor throne, the role was a prison. This explains why Elizabeth never married. The pressure from her council to produce an heir was immense. Every king in Europe wanted her hand. They sent portraits and gold and promises of power, but Elizabeth refused them all. She famously said that she was married to her kingdom. While the world saw this as a sign of her devotion, the hidden truth suggests it was a matter of biological necessity. She could not marry because she could not produce an heir, and she could not allow a husband to discover the truth of her body in the privacy of the royal bed. The moral decay of this secret extended to the inner circle of her advisors. Men like William Cecil and Robert Dudley must have suspected the truth. There are letters in the archives that speak of the Queen's strange nature. Foreign ambassadors wrote home to Spain and France describing a ruler who possessed the heart and stomach of a king. They meant it as a compliment to her strength, but perhaps they were being more literal than they realized. These men stayed silent because the secret gave them power. As long as they protected the Queen, they protected their own positions in the court. They were complicit in a lie that spanned decades. As we move deeper into the night, the air in Richmond Palace grows colder. We return to the deathbed. The year is 1603 again. The Queen has ruled for 44 years. She has seen the Spanish Armada defeated. She has seen the expansion of the New World. She has seen the greatest poets and playwrights like William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe rise to fame under her patronage. But as she sits on her cushions on the floor, refusing to go to bed, she is a woman or perhaps a man haunted by the ghost of a girl. who died in a village 60 years ago. The informative nature of this history is found in the specific rituals of the Tudor court. The Queen's body was considered sacred ground. Even her laundry was handled with a level of security that we would associate with modern intelligence agencies. Why was she so protective of her private chambers? Why did she insist on dressing herself with only a few select and aging ladies in waiting who had been with her since her youth? The answer lies in the loyalty of the silent. These women were the keepers of the golden mask. They were the ones who applied the white lead every morning. They were the ones who tightened the corsets to create a shape that nature had not provided. Consider the physical toll of the lid makeup. For an American or Tier 1 audience interested in the science of history, it is important to know that the Venetian cerused by the Queen was a deadly mixture of white lead and vinegar. Over decades, it would have seeped into the skin, causing hair loss, skin decay, and mental deterioration. Elizabeth's famous red wigs were not just a fashion choice. They were a necessity because her own hair had been destroyed by the very mask she used to hide her identity. The moral decay of the story is mirrored in the physical decay of the ruler. To maintain the lie, she had to slowly poison herself. In these quiet moments of the night, as you listen to the steady rhythm of history, imagine the silence of the palace. The halls are lined with portraits of a woman who never truly existed. The empty throne in the Great Hall is a symbol of a lineage that ended in 1542. Every act of Parliament and every death warrant signed by the Queen was technically the work of a commoner from Bisley. The sheer scale of the deception is enough to make the mind wander into the shadows of what else we might have been told that isn't true, but the secret was almost revealed in the final moments. As the Queen lay dying, she lost the ability to speak. Her advisors gathered around her, desperate for her to name a successor. They needed her to point to James of Scotland to ensure a peaceful transition of power. But Elizabeth remained silent. Some say she was protecting the secret until the very last breath. If she named James, she was handing the crown back to the true royal line, but she was also acknowledging that her own time was over. When the breath finally left the body of the Queen, the room did not erupt in noise. There was a terrible, heavy silence. The ladies of the bedchamber moved in. They were the ones tasked with preparing the body for the embalmers. They had served this person for years, but they had never seen the Queen truly exposed. As they removed the heavy velvet robes, as they unlaced the restrictive corsets, and as they began to wash away the thick white mask of lead, they saw the truth. The documents from that night are hidden. They are not in the public records of the British Library. They are whispered in the private journals of the noble families who were present. It is said that Lady Scrope, one of the Queen's closest attendants, walked to the window and dropped a sapphire ring to a man waiting on a horse below. This was the signal to the world that the Queen was dead. But inside the room, the sapphire was the least of their concerns. They were looking at a body that carried the undeniable marks of a man. The betrayal felt by the kingdom would have been absolute. If the news had leaked, the Tudor myth would have shattered. The Church of England, of which the Queen was the head, would have been delegitimized. The wars fought in her name would have been seen as illegal. So the decision was made in the dark. The secret would be buried with the body. The golden mask would be kept on even in the tomb. This is why the funeral of Elizabeth I was so strange. The lead coffin was sealed almost immediately. There was no lying in state where the public could view the body of their beloved Queen. Instead, a wax effigy was created. A lifelike doll was placed on top of the coffin, dressed in the Queen's finest clothes and her famous red wig. This wax mask is what the people of England mourned. They did not mourn a woman. They mourned an image. They mourned a lie that had been crafted so perfectly that it had become the truth. Even today in Westminster Abbey, the tomb of Elizabeth I is a place of pilgrimage. People from all over the world, including the United States and Canada, travel there to see the final resting place of the Virgin Queen. They look at the marble monument, and they see the face of a powerful woman, but they do not know what lies beneath the stone. They do not know about the village of Bisley. They do not know about the small grave in the woods where a 9-year-old girl might actually be resting, while a boy from the countryside sleeps in the heart of the abbey. As you drift closer to sleep, think about the masks we all wear. Think about the secrets that are kept to protect the structures of our world. History is not just a list of dates and names. It is a series of choices made by people who were afraid of the truth. The story of the Golden Mask is a reminder that power is often a performance, and the greatest rulers are often the greatest actors. But as the candles flicker and the shadows stretch across the floor of the palace, we must ask ourselves one final question. If the Queen was a substitute, then who were the people who truly knew? There are rumors of a letter written in the final days and burned before the Archbishop could see it. A letter that explained why the crown was hollow and why the empty throne was the only thing Elizabeth truly left behind. The secret of the Tudor line did not end with the death of the Queen. It left a lingering unease in the air of England, a sense that the foundation of the monarchy was built on a midnight grave. And as we leave the quiet chambers of Richmond Palace and step out into the mist of the morning, we begin to see a new shadow on the horizon, a shadow that leads us away from the palaces of London and toward a different kind of mystery, one that involves a different kind of substitution. The secret of the Golden Mask was safely tucked away under the marble of the Abbey, but the consequences were just beginning to unfold. As James VI of Scotland rode south to claim the throne of England, he carried with him a strange and ancient document he had found in his mother's private collection. It was a letter that spoke of a child sent away to the Cotswolds and a fever that changed the world. James knew that to keep his new crown he would have to keep the secret of his predecessor. But he also knew that the secret was not just about Elizabeth. It was about a darker ritual that had been practiced by the Tudor court to ensure their survival. He realized that the Bisley Boy was only the beginning of a much larger conspiracy that involved the very blood of the royal family, a conspiracy that would lead him to a hidden room in the Tower of London where the walls were covered in a script that was not English or Latin, a script that spoke of a different kind of substitute, a substitute of the soul itself. The history of the world is often written in blood and gold, but its most terrifying secrets are written in the silence of a fever ward. In the summer of 1542, a betrayal was born in the rolling green hills of the Cotswolds. It was a forbidden choice made in a moment of absolute panic. A lie so profound that it did not just save a few lives, but it reshaped the entire destiny of the British Empire. We are told that the young Princess Elizabeth was a survivor, but the truth buried in the cold earth of a village garden suggests something far more sinister. A curse of identity was placed upon a common child while the true royal heir was lowered into a nameless grave. The records were burned, the witnesses were sworn to silence, and the king was fed a deception that would last until the end of his days. This was not just a medical emergency. It was a historical heist of the soul. The child who died was the last true Tudor girl, and the child who lived was a phantom playing a role for a crown. This is the truth the king buried. Now let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We are leaving the grand halls of Richmond and traveling back 60 years to a time of heat and fear. The year is 1542, and the air of England is thick with the invisible shadow of the sweating sickness. To understand why a princess would be hidden in the countryside, we must understand the terror of the 16th century. For the people of the Tudor era, the sweating sickness, or Sutor Anglicus, was a mysterious and swift executioner. It was not like the plague, which moved slowly and left visible marks. The sweat was a phantom. It could strike a man at breakfast and have him in his shroud by dinner. It was a disease that seemed to target the robust and the wealthy, and no one was more robust or more wealthy than the family of Henry VIII. Henry was a man obsessed with his legacy. He had broken with Rome and dismantled the monasteries, all for the sake of a stable bloodline. By 1542, his son Edward was the fragile hope of the nation, but his daughter Elizabeth was the backup. She was the living proof of his union with Anne Boleyn, and even though he had executed her mother, he still valued the girl as a political tool. When the reports of the sweat reaching London began to filter into the palace, the king did what any terrified father with too many enemies would do. He ordered his daughter to be moved. The destination was Bisley, a small secluded village in the Cotswolds. It was chosen for its isolation and its clean hill air. At that time, the Cotswolds were not the tourist destination they are today. They were a rugged working landscape of sheep and stone. Bisley sat atop a ridge surrounded by deep valleys and ancient forests. It was the perfect place to hide a princess from a plague. Elizabeth was only 9 years old. She was a precocious child with bright red hair and a sharp intellect that already mirrored her father's iron will. She was accompanied by a skeleton crew of servants led by the woman who was a second mother to her, Cot Ashley. Cot was more than a governess. She was a protector and a confidant. She knew the weight of the child she carried. If Elizabeth stayed healthy, Cot would be the most powerful woman in the court. If Elizabeth died, Cot would be nothing. The journey to the manor house at Bisley was long and exhausting. The princes traveled in a litter protected from the dust of the road. As they climbed higher into the hills, the air became cooler, but the tension within the group did not break. They knew that the sickness was moving faster than any horse. They heard rumors of entire villages in the valleys below being wiped out in a single weekend. When they finally arrived at the stone manor, the gates were locked behind them. They were in a self-imposed prison. For the first few weeks, the plan seemed to work. The princess spent her days in the garden and her evenings studying Greek and Latin. She was a picture of Tudor health. But the Cotswolds hills hold their secrets close, and the wind that blew through the stone corridors of the manor carried more than the scent of pine. It began on a Thursday evening in August. Elizabeth complained of a slight chill. At first, Cot Ashley thought it was simply the cooling air of the hills. She wrapped the child in wool and sat her by the fire. But by midnight, the chill had turned into a raging fire. The princess was sweating. Not the normal sweat of a child at play, but a deep, drenching moisture that smelled of copper and fear. The Sutor Anglicus had found its way inside the stone walls. Cot Ashley did not call for the village doctor. To do so would be to announce to the world that the princess was compromised. Instead, she relied on the limited medicine of the house. She used rosewater to cool the girl's forehead. She burned sage to purify the air. She prayed with a desperation that only those who have seen the king's wrath can understand. But the fever was relentless. For 3 days the manor house was a tomb of silence. The servants moved on tiptoe, afraid that even a loud footstep would snap the fragile thread of the girl's life. Elizabeth moved between states of delirium and deep unconsciousness. In her waking moments she cried out for her father. In her sleeping moments she was as still as a statue. As an audience listening to this, in the quiet of your own room, imagine the atmosphere of that chamber. The only light came from a single tallow candle that cast long, flickering shadows against the tapestries. The sound of the wind outside was the only thing breaking the silence. Ashley sat by the bed, her eyes red from lack of sleep, watching the rise and fall of the princess's chest. She knew that every breath might be the last, and she knew that if that breath stopped, her own life was effectively over. The sweating sickness was a psychological weapon, as much as a physical one. In the 16th century, people believed that the air itself was a carrier of divine punishment. They called it miasma. To the servants in the Bisley manor, the fact that the princes had fallen ill was a sign that the Tudor blood was being judged. They whispered in the kitchens about the ghost of Anne Boleyn. They whispered about the sins of the king. Ashley heard these whispers, and she crushed them with a cold look. She was a woman of incredible strength, but even she was beginning to break. The princess was fading. The red hair was matted with sweat, and the sharp eyes were sunken and dull. By the third night, the fever had reached its peak. The medical reality of the time was brutal. There were no antibiotics, no modern cooling blankets. There was only the hope that the body's own strength could outlast the fire of the infection. But Elizabeth was a small child, and the sweat was a giant. In the early hours of the morning, just as the first gray light of dawn began to touch the Cotswolds hills, the breathing changed. It became shallow and ragged. Ashley took the girl's hand. It was cold. This is the paradox of the sweating sickness. The skin burns, but the extremities go ice cold as the heart begins to fail. The moment of death was not dramatic. There were no final words. There was only a long, slow exhale, and then a silence that felt heavier than the stone walls of the manor. Princess Elizabeth Tudor, the daughter of Henry VIII, was dead. The panic that followed was a living thing. Ashley did not scream. She could not afford to scream. She stood over the body and felt the world collapsing around her. She thought of the king's visit. Henry had already sent word that he would be arriving in Bisley within the week to see his daughter and to escape the heat of London. He was coming for a living princess. If he found a corpse, he would see a conspiracy. He would see a failure of care that he would punish with the axe. This is the point where history diverges from the textbooks. The official narrative says Elizabeth recovered, but the legendary accounts from the village of Bisley, passed down through generations of stonemasons and farmers, tell a different story. They tell of a secret burial in the middle of the night. They tell of a small wooden casket lowered into the earth beneath the floorboards of the manor, or perhaps in a hidden corner of the garden where the lavender grew thickest. Ashley knew she had hours to make a choice. She could tell the truth and lose her head, or she could create a lie and save her life. She called for the two most loyal servants in the house, men who were tied to her by blood or by secrets. They stood in the chamber with the dead princess, and they made a pact that would hold for 60 years. They would find a substitute, but where do you find a replacement for a Tudor princess? You cannot look in the noble houses because the nobility are all connected. You cannot look in the distant cities because there is no time. You must look in the immediate vicinity. You must look in the village of Bisley itself. The servants were sent out into the dawn. Their mission was simple but impossible. Find a child with red gold hair. Find a child of roughly 9 years. Find a child whose parents would not ask questions or whose parents were already dead from the sweat. The village of Bisley was in mourning. The sickness had taken many of the local children. There were many empty beds in the cottages. But there was one house on the edge of the ridge where a young boy lived. He was an orphan being raised by an aunt who was herself clinging to life. The boy was known for his delicate features and his startlingly bright red hair. He was a boy who spent his time in the fields far from the other children. He was a boy who looked like a ghost dot, and the psychological depth of this moment imagine the boy's perspective. He is taken from a cold cottage in the middle of the night by men in royal livery. He is brought to a grand manor house. He is washed and dressed in silks that feel like water against his skin. He is told that his name is no longer his own. He is told that if he speaks, he will die. He is told that from this moment on he is the daughter of a king. For the American audience who loves the idea of a self-made identity, this is the ultimate transformation. It was not a choice made for ambition. It was a choice made for survival. The boy was a blank slate. He was young enough to be molded. He was terrified enough to be silent. But the transformation was not just about clothes. It was about the spirit. Cot Ashley spent the next 48 hours in a fever of her own. She taught the boy how to walk with the grace of a princess. She taught him how to hold his head. She taught him the few words of Greek that the real Elizabeth had been practicing. Most importantly, she taught him the secret language of the Tudor court. The subtle nods the way to look down, to avoid a direct gaze the way to hide. The hands in the long sleeves of the gown dot the moral decay of the story begins here. To save herself, Cot Ashley stole a life. She erased a boy's identity and replaced it with a dead girl's shadow. She was playing a god of history. And as the sound of horse hooves began to echo in the valley below, she knew the final test was coming. The king was here. Henry VIII was a man of immense physical presence. By 1542, he was no longer the handsome athlete of his youth. He was a massive, brooding figure of power suffering from a leg wound that never healed, and a temper that was as unpredictable as a summer storm. When his carriage pulled up to the manor in Bisley, the very ground seemed to tremble. Cot Ashley stood at the top of the stone steps. Her heart was beating so loudly she was sure the king could hear it through her bodice. Behind her in the shadows of the doorway stood the substitute. The boy was dressed in the finest gown the real Elizabeth owned. A high collar of lace hid the line of his throat. A velvet cap covered his ears. He was a masterpiece of deception. The king did not dismount his horse easily. He was assisted by his guards, his face twisted in a grimace of pain. He looked up at the manor house and his eyes searched for his daughter. This was the moment. This was the second where 60 years of history hung in the balance. If Henry saw through the lie, the boy would be executed, Cot Ashley would be burned, and the Tudor line would have changed that afternoon. But Henry was a man who saw what he wanted to see. He had not seen Elizabeth in nearly a year. In a year, a child changes. They grow taller, their faces lose the roundness of infancy. More importantly, Henry was terrified of the sickness. He did not want to get too close to anyone who might be carrying the miasma. He stood at a distance, his hand on his sword hilt, and looked at the small figure in the doorway. The boy did exactly as he was told. He curtsied deeply, his head bowed. He did not speak. Ashley stepped forward and explained that the princess was still recovering from a minor throat ailment brought on by the damp air of the hills. She said the princess's voice was weak and that the doctors had ordered her to remain silent to protect her lungs. Henry nodded. He was satisfied. He saw the red hair, he saw the royal silks, and he saw the submission he expected from a daughter. He praised Ashley for her diligence, and he left a bag of gold for the princess's continued care. He did not stay the night. The fear of the sweat was too great. He turned his carriage around and headed back toward the safety of his other palaces. The relief that swept through the manor was like a physical wave, but it was a short-lived relief. Ashley realized that the lie could not end with the king's departure. The boy could not go back to his cottage. The real Elizabeth was still in the ground. The substitute was now a permanent fixture of the state. This is where the story becomes truly hypnotic. Think about the years that followed. The boy had to grow up as a woman. He had to learn to navigate the most dangerous court in Europe. Every day was a performance. Every meal was a risk. He had to learn to hide the changes that puberty would bring. He had to learn to live without the intimacy of a partner or the care of a physician. The psychological layer here is staggering. Did the boy eventually forget he was a boy? Did the mask become the skin? Historians who support the Bisley Boy theory point to Elizabeth's later life as evidence. They point to her famous statement that she had the heart and stomach of a king, but the body of a weak and feeble woman. Perhaps she was being more literal than anyone realized. Perhaps she was acknowledging that her internal identity was masculine while her external role was feminine. The American and Tier 1 audience values the truth above all else. But the truth of history is often a matter of what we choose to believe. The evidence for the Cotswolds fever is found in the physical gaps of the record. Why did Elizabeth never marry? Why did she refuse to have her body embalmed after death? Why did she give such specific orders that no one was to touch her corpse until it was safely in the coffin? As you listen to the sound of my voice, imagine the wind blowing over the ridges of Bisley today. The stone manor still stands. The garden still grows lavender. And somewhere beneath the soil there is a secret that has never been officially acknowledged. The true Elizabeth Tudor is part of the earth of the Cotswolds. The woman who ruled England was a child of the hills, a substitute who played the part so well that she became the greatest queen the world has ever known. The moral decay of this story is not in the lie itself, but in the necessity of it. To maintain the stability of a nation, a boy's life was erased. To protect the heads of a few servants, a history was forged. We like to think that our leaders are who they say they are. But the shadows of 1542 suggest that the crown is often a hollow thing filled by whoever is brave enough to wear the mask. The story of the fever in the Cotswolds is a story of a world in transition. It is the moment when the Tudor bloodline became a Tudor performance. And as we move forward in our journey, we begin to see how this performance required more than just a substitute. It required a physical transformation that would defy nature itself. But as the night grows deeper and the hills of the Cotswolds fade into the darkness, we must look at the next layer of the deception. Because the substitute did not just have to look like a princess. The substitute had to survive the most intense scrutiny in the world. And that scrutiny was about to come from the most dangerous person of all. The king had been fooled, but the king was not the only one watching. There was another member of the household who had known the real Elizabeth since she was in the cradle. A man who noticed that the princess's handwriting had changed. A man who noticed that her favorite songs no longer brought her joy. This man was a spy for a rival house, and he was beginning to realize that the girl in the manor was not a girl at all. He was preparing a letter that would expose the lie to the entire world. But before he could send it, he discovered something even more shocking about the boy from Bisley. Something that suggested the substitution was not the only secret being kept in the dark dot in the hidden. History of England, there is a moment where the blood of kings stopped and the era of the commoner began in silence. Imagine a darkened room in a stone manor where a governess stares at a dead princess and a terrified village boy. This was the birth of the Bisley secret, a betrayal so absolute that it turned the entire Tudor dynasty into a hollow theater. It was a forbidden exchange made under the shadow of the executioner's axe. A lie that would be buried under 60 years of royal decrees and golden gowns. The girl who was born to rule was gone, and in her place sat a substitute who was forced to steal a life to survive. This was the moment a common child was placed on the path to becoming a queen, and in that transformation a curse of deception was woven into the very fabric of the nation. The people cheered for a royal they believed was the daughter of Henry VIII, but they were bowing to a phantom created in the Cotswolds hills. This is the truth the king buried. Now let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air as we move into the heavy stillness of that fateful night in 1542. We are no longer in the palaces of London, but in the heart of Bisley, where the air is cold and the weight of a secret is enough to crush the soul. To understand the Bisley secret, we must look into the eyes of Cot Ashley in the moments after the real Elizabeth Tudor breathed her last. Cot was a woman of sharp ambition and fierce loyalty, but that night she was a woman paralyzed by the sheer scale of her failure. A dead princess was a death sentence for everyone in the house. The king was coming. His rage was legendary. His mercy was non-existent. The servants stood in the flickering candlelight watching the red gold hair of the true princess lose its luster, but then the search began. In the darkness of the surrounding village, a child was found. History does not record his birth name, but legend calls him the Bisley Boy. He was an orphan, a child of the hills, with the same startling hair and the same pale skin as the Tudors. He was a commoner whose only value to the world until that night was his labor in the fields. But in the desperate minds of the royal household, he became the only hope for survival. The substitution was not a simple matter of a new face. It was a total erasure of a human being. Imagine that child being brought into the manor. He is stripped of his rough wool clothes and scrubbed clean in a copper basin. He is dressed in the fine linens and the heavy silk gowns of a princess. The fabric is heavy and stiff, unlike anything he has ever felt. The laces are tightened until he can barely breathe. He is no longer a boy of the fields. He is now a prisoner of the crown. The psychological layer of this moment is profound for a Tier 1 audience. This was the ultimate case of identity theft. The boy was only 9 years old. At that age, the mind is a mirror. He was told that his past was a lie. He was told that his family was gone and that his future depended on his ability to never speak a word of the truth. Cot Ashley and the senior servants became his trainers, his directors, and his jailers. They spent the hours before dawn drilling him on the walk of a royal. A princess does not run. She does not stride. She glides. She carries her head as if it is a heavy jewel. The informative history of this period tells us that the education of Elizabeth was one of the most rigorous in English history. She was known for her mastery of languages and her deep understanding of political philosophy. But if we follow the Bisley secret, we must ask how a village boy could possibly learn such things. The answer lies in the intense pressure of the situation. The substitute had the best tutors in the world and a reason to learn that was more powerful than any scholar's ambition. If he failed a lesson, he risked exposure. If he was exposed, he would die. The transformation of the Bisley Boy into the Princess Elizabeth was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Ashley knew that the physical resemblance was only the first layer. The real challenge was the mind. In the weeks that followed the king's brief and terrified visit, the manor house became a secret school of deception. Every meal was a lesson. The substitute had to learn the complex etiquette of the Tudor table. He had to learn which fork to use, which cup to hold, and how to address the servants with a cold, distant authority. He had to learn to hide his hands. A boy's hands are different from a girl's, and as he grew, the task of concealing his physical nature became a daily battle. He wore long, flowing sleeves and heavy rings. He learned to use his fans and his handkerchiefs as props to distract the eye, but the most critical part of the training was the voice. A 9-year-old boy and a 9-year-old girl sound remarkably similar, but as the years passed, the risk of a deepening voice became a constant threat. This is why the historical records often mention Elizabeth's deep and commanding voice. It was described as a sign of her strength and her kingly nature. But in the context of the Bisley secret, it was simply the voice of a man being masked by the authority of a queen. The atmospheric build of this story requires us to think about the isolation of the substitute. He could have no friends. He could have no true confidants outside of the small circle who knew the secret. He was a child who lived in a state of perpetual performance. Every word he spoke was calculated. Every smile was a mask. The moral decay here is found in the way the servants used this child. They were not protecting him. They were protecting themselves. They had turned a human being into a political instrument. As the months turned into years, the substitute began to master the role. The real Elizabeth had been a bright student, but the substitute became a genius. He studied the works of Cicero and Virgil. He learned to speak French, Italian, and Spanish. He became a master of the needlework that was expected of a young lady of the court. His needlework was famously precise and complex. Perhaps it was a way for him to focus his mind, a way to find a moment of peace in a life that was a constant lie. For an American audience interested in the concept of the self-made individual, the Bisley Boy is a fascinating figure. He was a commoner who became the most powerful person in the world by sheer force of will and education. He was not born to the blood, but he was trained to the throne. This raises the question of what truly makes a leader. Is it the lineage or is it the performance of the role? Historical archives show that Elizabeth was often described as being unlike other women. She was praised for her masculine mind and her unflinching courage. Her advisors often remarked that she was more like her father, Henry, than any of his other children. If the Bisley secret is true, then these observations were not just metaphors. They were literal descriptions of the person beneath the gown. The psychological toll on the substitute must have been immense. He lived in a world where he was constantly being watched by spies from foreign courts. The Spanish and French ambassadors were always looking for a weakness. They wanted to find a reason to delegitimize the Tudor line. They watched the way she walked, they listened to the way she spoke, and they reported back to their kings. But the substitute never faltered. He was more Elizabeth than Elizabeth herself could have ever been. To understand the Bisley secret, we must also consider the physical reality of the life the substitute led. The Tudor court was a place of sensory overload. The smell of expensive perfumes mixed with the scent of unwashed bodies. The sound of lutes and virginals echoed through the halls. The visual feast of gold leaf and vibrant tapestries was meant to overwhelm the visitor. And at the center of it all was the princess. The clothing of a Tudor royal was not just fashion. It was armor. The heavy farthingales, the rigid corsets, and the high ruffs were designed to create a silhouette that was more than human. For the Bisley substitute, this armor was a blessing. It hid the development of his body. It allowed him to create a shape that fit the expectations of the world. He spent hours every day being stitched into these garments. The process was slow and ritualistic. It was the daily construction of a queen, but what of the real Elizabeth? While the substitute was learning to navigate the court, the body of the true princes remained in the earth of the Cotswolds. The legends of Bisley mention a stone coffin found in the 18th century during a renovation of the manor grounds. Inside was the skeletal remains of a young girl dressed in fine Tudor silks. The local people have long believed this was the evidence of the swap. Think about the silence of that grave. While the boy was winning the hearts of the English people, the girl whose name he had stolen was forgotten by history. The moral decay of the secret is found in this erasure. A princess was replaced and the world never noticed. This is the power of a well-crafted lie. It becomes more real than the truth. The atmospheric building of our story now moves to the psychological reflection. Did the substitute ever feel guilt? Did he look in the mirror and see the boy from the hills, or did he only see the red hair and the pale skin of the queen? In his private moments when the candles were low and the ladies-in-waiting were asleep, did he remember the sound of the sheep in the fields of Bisley? Or had that memory been scrubbed away by the constant repetition of his royal duties? The informational value of this story is found in the specific political climate of the 1540s and 50s. England was a powder keg of religious and political tension. The Reformation had torn the country apart. The succession was always in doubt. The substitute was not just playing a part for himself. He was playing it for the stability of the realm. If he had been discovered, the country would have descended into civil war. The secret was the only thing holding the nation together. This pressure created a personality that was both brilliant and terrifying. Elizabeth was known for her mercurial nature. She could be kind and generous one moment and cold and vengeful the next. This unpredictability was a defensive mechanism. It kept people at a distance. It ensured that no one got too close to the person behind the mask. She never allowed anyone to see her without her full regalia. She never allowed anyone to touch her skin for the tear. One audience, this story is a reminder that history is a collection of narratives that we choose to believe. We want to believe in the Virgin Queen. We want to believe in the Golden Age. But the Bisley secret suggests that the Golden Age was built on a foundation of shadow. The substitute was a genius of survival. He took a common life and turned it into a legend. As the years passed, the substitute grew into the role so completely that the Bisley Boy was no more. The boy had been consumed by the Queen. When Elizabeth finally took the throne in 1558, she was a seasoned performer. She had survived the reigns of her brother Edward and her sister Mary. She had survived the Tower of London. She had survived every attempt to expose her. The coronation was the ultimate triumph of the lie. As the crown was placed on her head, the boy from the Cotswolds became the anointed of God. The secret was now protected by the highest power in the land. The servants who had orchestrated the swap were now the most trusted advisors in the court. They were bound together by a secret that could destroy them all, but as the new queen began her reign, a new challenge emerged. The world wanted an heir, the counselors wanted a marriage, and the substitute knew that this was the one thing he could never provide. He had spent his life hiding his body, but he could not hide the truth of biology in a marriage bed. This was the beginning of the virgin queen myth. It was a political solution to a biological problem, the atmospheric. Build of this section ends with the image of the queen sitting alone in her private chambers. The light of the candles is reflecting in the gold of her gown. She is the most powerful woman in the world, but she is also the most isolated. She is a substitute in a crown, a commoner playing a god. And as she looks into the darkness, she knows that the secret is safe as long as she stays behind the mask. But the mask was about to be tested in a way she never expected. Because while the king had been fooled and the court had been silenced, there was one person who had been watching from the beginning. Someone who had not been at Bisley, but who had studied every letter and every portrait. A man who understood the art of the disguise because he was a master of it. Himself, the queen had mastered the art of the silence, but a silence can be broken by a single question. In the winter of 1559, a man arrived at the court with a gift that was not a gift. It was a portrait of the real Elizabeth Tudor, painted just days before she left for the Cotswolds. As he placed the painting before the queen, he watched her eyes. He was not looking for a royal response. He was looking for the flicker of fear in the eyes of a village boy. He leaned in and whispered a name that the queen had not heard in 20 years, a name that belonged to a cottage on a ridge. The secret was no longer a secret. It was a weapon. And the man who held it was about to reveal why the queen's refusal to see a doctor was the least of her problems in the high-stakes world of the Tudor court. A single touch could be a death warrant. For 44 years, Queen Elizabeth I reigned with an iron will and a porcelain face, but behind that mask lay a terrifying physical secret that she protected with a ferocity that bordered on madness. This was a betrayal of the very essence of royal duty, a forbidden boundary drawn between a monarch and her physicians. In an era where the health of the sovereign was the health of the state, her absolute refusal to be touched or examined was more than a quirk. It was a massive and world-altering cover-up. Every time she fell ill, every time the council begged for a medical report, she risked her life and her kingdom to keep the lie alive. This was a curse of silence that she wore like a suit of armor. She would rather die than allow a doctor to see the reality of her form. The history books call it vanity, but the hidden record calls it survival. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air as we move into the inner sanctum of the queen's private life. We leave the public halls of state and enter the candlelit silence of the royal bedchamber, where the air is heavy with the smell of sweet herbs and the unsaid fears of a ruler who could never let her guard down. To understand why the most powerful woman in the world would live in terror of a doctor's touch, we must look at the nature of medicine in the 16th century. For a Tier 1 audience interested in the raw facts of history, it is important to realize that a Tudor physician was as much a philosopher as a scientist. They believed in the four humors. They believed that the body was a balance of blood phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. To treat a king or a queen, they would often demand to see the skin, to feel the pulse, and to examine the most private functions of the body. For Elizabeth, This was an impossible demand. If she truly was the substitute from Bisley, if the person on the throne was a man playing the part of a woman, a physical examination would have ended the Tudor dynasty in a single afternoon. Therefore, she had to create a fortress around her physical self. She turned her bedchamber into a no-fly zone for any man who held a medical degree. The first major crisis occurred in October of 1562. This is one of the most informative moments in her reign. The Queen was young, only 29 years old. She was at Hampton Court Palace when she began to shiver with a fever that would not break. Within hours, the unmistakable red spots of smallpox began to appear on her skin. This was the moment the council had dreaded. Smallpox was a killer of kings. If the Queen died without an heir, England would descend into a bloody civil war between the supporters of Mary, Queen of Scots, and the Protestant nobility. The royal physicians were summoned in a panic. They arrived with their lancets and their herbs, desperate to perform their duties. But even as she drifted into a coma, Elizabeth had left strict orders. No doctor was to touch her. No man was to undress her. Only her ladies of the bedchamber, women like Cot Ashley and Blanche Parry, were allowed to stay. Imagine the psychological tension in that room. The doctors were screaming through the door that the Queen needed to be bled. They argued that her humors were out of balance and that without their intervention she would surely perish. But the ladies stood like a wall. They knew the secret. They knew that if a physician were to peel back the royal nightgown to find a pulse or to apply a poultice, the mask would slip. They watched as the Queen's breath became shallow. They watched as the red spots turned into painful blisters. They were prepared to let her die of the pox rather than be exposed by a doctor. The survival of Elizabeth from the smallpox in 1562 was seen as a miracle. But for the Queen, it was a warning. She realized that her body was her greatest enemy. To remain in power, she had to remain a mystery. This mystery was put to its ultimate test during the long and complex marriage negotiations that define the middle of her reign. For the American and Tier 1 audience looking for the deep psychological layers of this story, the marriage. Treaties are a goldmine of information. In the 16th century, a royal marriage was not about love. It was a legal and biological contract. When the Duke of Anjou, a French prince, sought Elizabeth's hand in 1579, the French ambassadors insisted on a physical report. They needed to know if the Queen was capable of bearing a child. They needed to know if her body natural was healthy and functional. The French sent their own doctors to London. These men were some of the finest in Europe, trained in the schools of Paris and Padua. They were not easily fooled by courtly language. They demanded a personal audience. They wanted to examine the Queen's complexion. They wanted to see the clarity of her eyes, and they wanted a report from her own physicians regarding her monthly cycles. The Queen's response was a masterclass in political evasion. She played a game of delay and distraction. She would grant an audience only in the evening in rooms lit by low, flickering candles. She would wear high ruffs that reached her chin and sleeves that covered her wrists. She would use her legendary wit to turn every medical question into a philosophical debate. When the French doctors pressed for a physical check, she would claim a sudden and mysterious headache, or a bout of the vapors that required her to retire to her bed alone, but the pressure was immense. Her own council, led by William Cecil, was pushing for the marriage. They believed an heir was the only way to save England. Cecil even went so far as to bribe one of the Queen's ladies to give him information about her health. But the ladies were loyal to the secret. They provided vague and useless reports. They spoke of the Queen's delicate nature and her regal constitution, but they never gave a single physical detail. Think about the psychological toll on Elizabeth. Every day for months, she was at the center of a medical investigation. Every person she met was looking for a sign of her gender or her health. She had to maintain a perfect feminine performance, while her advisors were literally debating the mechanics of her womb in the next room. This is the moral decay of the Tudor state. A woman's worth was reduced to her biology, and for Elizabeth that biology was a forbidden zone. The Queen eventually broke off the negotiations with the Duke of Anjou. She famously stated that she would never marry because she was already wed to her people. The world saw this as a sacrifice for the nation, but we can see it as the ultimate defensive move. A marriage would have required a physical intimacy that was impossible for the substitute from Bisley. A husband would have seen what the doctors were forbidden to see. The Virgin Queen was not a choice of purity, it was a choice of survival. This period of her life also saw the rise of a new and dangerous threat. The rise of Dr. Rodrigo Lopes. Lopes was a Portuguese physician who became the Queen's primary doctor in the 1580s. He was a man of great intelligence and ambition. He was one of the few people allowed into the inner circle. But even Lopes was kept at a distance. He was allowed to prescribe tonics and potions. He was allowed to advise on her diet. But he was never allowed to touch the Queen's skin. The archive of his reports is fascinating. He describes a queen who is perpetually healthy yet constantly in need of restorative waters. He describes a ruler who is in absolute control of her medical narrative. But eventually Lopes became a victim of the very secrecy he served. He was accused of a plot to poison the Queen, a charge that many modern historians believe was fabricated by his rivals. He was executed in 1594. The secret remained safe, and the only man who might have been clever enough to bridge the distance between the doctor and the patient was silenced forever. As the Queen aged, the measures she took to hide her physical reality became even more extreme. The bedchamber became a fortress guarded by a select group of women who had spent their entire lives in the Queen's service. These women were the ladies of the bedchamber, and they were the true power behind the throne. They were the only ones who saw the Queen without her ruffs and her farthingales. For the listener seeking a hypnotic and atmospheric build, imagine the morning ritual in the royal palace. It is 4 a.m. The air is cold. The Queen is being prepared for the day. This was not a simple task of dressing. It was a construction of a monarch. The ladies would apply the heavy layers of linen and silk. They would tighten the corsets made of whalebone and steel. They would use pads and rolls of fabric to create the illusion of a female form. During this hours-long process, no doctor, no advisor, and no male relative was allowed to enter. Even the Queen's own favorite Robert Dudley was famously barred from her private rooms when she was not fully dressed. This secrecy created a wall of separation. It allowed the Queen to be seen as a goddess rather than a human being. It reinforced the idea that she was the body politic, a spiritual entity that was above the weaknesses of the flesh, but the physical reality was still there. As the Queen reached her 60s, she began to suffer from the long-term effects of the Venetian ceruse, the white lead makeup that she used to mask her skin. The lid was poisoning her system. It was causing her hair to fall out, her teeth to rot, and her skin to become gray and brittle. A doctor would have recognized these symptoms immediately. A physician would have told her to wash the lead away to breathe the fresh air. and to eat a diet rich in iron, but Elizabeth refused. She could not wash away the lead because the lead was the only thing hiding the masculine features that were becoming more prominent as she aged. She could not consult a doctor about her rotting teeth because she would not allow anyone to look inside her mouth. Instead, she stuffed her cheeks with rolls of fine white cloth to maintain the shape of her face. She wore massive, elaborate wigs to hide her baldness. She used even more lead to create a mask of eternal youth. The moral decay of this story is found in the physical suffering the queen endured to maintain her power. She lived in constant pain. The heavy gowns weighed down her aching joints. The lead makeup irritated her skin and clouded her mind. Yet she never once called for a medical exam. She never once admitted that she was anything less than the divine Virgin Queen. For the American audience who values transparency and health, this is a terrifying look at the cost of the crown. It shows a person who had become a prisoner of their own deception. The substitute from Bisley had won. The boy had lived to be an old woman, but the cost was a life lived in a state of perpetual medical neglect. She was the most powerful person in the world, but she was less cared for than a common laborer in the fields. The night grows deeper and the shadows in your own room begin to stretch. Think about the silence of the Queen's final years. She became a ghost haunting her own palaces. She walked through the halls of Whitehall and Richmond, her heavy jewelry clanking like chains. She refused to sit down, she refused to sleep, and most importantly, she refused to see the doctors who were begging to treat her. She knew that the end was coming, and she knew that the greatest danger was not death, but the discovery that would happen after death. She had to ensure that even in the grave, her physical reality remained a secret. This leads us to the final and most shocking measure she ever took. A command that would baffle historians for centuries, but one that makes perfect sense if you know the Bisley secret. In March of 1603, as the Queen lay on her cushions at Richmond Palace, she gave a final order to her ladies-in-waiting. She forbade them from ever allowing her body to be opened or embalmed. This was a direct contradiction of royal tradition. In the Tudor era, the body of a monarch was always open, the organs removed, and the remains treated with spices and resins to preserve them for the lying in state, but Elizabeth was adamant. She wanted her body to be sealed in a lead coffin the moment she passed. She wanted no physicians to touch her even in death. She wanted the mask to remain forever. This was her final act of survival. Even as the breath left her, she was protecting the lie that had built an empire. She was ensuring that the Virgin Queen would remain an untouchable icon and that the boy from the Cotswolds would never be found. As the candles in the palace begin to fade, we realize that the Queen's refusal to see a doctor was not about health. It was about the boundary of a forbidden truth. But as we look closer at the image she left behind, we begin to see that the lead makeup was more than a cosmetic choice. It was a chemical shield that hid a much darker transformation. The Queen had successfully barred the doctors, but she could not bar the air itself from reacting with the poison on her skin. The lead makeup was not just hiding her identity, it was changing the very chemistry of her body. In the final years, those who got close enough to the Queen in the dim light of the evening reported seeing something impossible beneath the white paste. They spoke of colors that did not belong on human skin and a texture that felt like cold stone. The mask was no longer just on top of her face. It was becoming her face. And as we move to the next chapter of The Secret, we discover that the lead was hiding a moral rot that had started in the royal nursery. and ended with a mask that could never be removed. In the candlelit corridors of history, there is no mask more famous and more lethal than the one worn by Elizabeth I. We are told she wore the white lead to hide the scars of a smallpox infection and the inevitable touch of age. But the truth buried beneath the layers of poisonous paste is far more terrifying. This was a chemical betrayal of a nation. It was a forbidden boundary created to protect a stolen identity. Every morning as the heavy white mixture was applied to her face, she was not just painting a portrait of a queen, she was burying a secret. She was layering a lie that would eventually corrode her skin and her mind. This mask was a shield against a truth that would have shattered the Tudor crown. It hid the sharp jawline and the masculine bone structure that nature had given to a boy from the Cotswolds. It was a curse of beauty built upon a foundation of toxic minerals. This was a world-altering cover-up that required the queen to slowly poison herself every single day. She lived behind a wall of white lead, hiding a reality that no one was permitted to see. This is the truth the king buried. Now let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We are entering the private world of the royal dressing room. The air is thick with the sharp smell of vinegar and the heavy metallic tongue of lead. We are moving away from the public, and into the silent sanctuary where a person becomes a legend through the art of the mask. To understand the layered lies of Elizabeth, we must first understand the substance known as Venetian ceruse. For the modern audience in America and the Tier 1 countries, this is a fascinating glimpse into the dangerous chemistry of power. Venetian ceruse was the most expensive and most sought-after cosmetic of the 16th century. It was a mixture of white lead and vinegar, often combined with egg whites or even a touch of mercury. It created a finish that was pure white and perfectly smooth. In the Elizabethan era, a pale white complexion was the ultimate symbol of status. It showed that you did not labor in the sun. It showed that you were of noble blood, but for the queen, the white lead was a necessity rather than a fashion choice. After her recovery from smallpox in 1562, her skin was said to be flawed. But a flawed skin is a human problem. The person on the throne needed to be more than human. They needed to be an icon. This is where the psychological layer of the story begins. Imagine sitting before a silver mirror every morning. The mirror reflects a face that you know is a lie. You see the features of the child from Bisley, the boy who was chosen to replace a dead princess. You see the growing strength of the chin and the texture of the skin that lead cannot naturally soften. The application of the makeup was a ritual that took hours. It was a slow, rhythmic process that is perfect for the quiet of a sleep story. First, the skin was washed with rose water. Then the first layer of the ceruse was applied with a soft sponge. It was a cold, thick paste that felt like a second skin. It pulled at the pores as it dried. Then came the second layer and the third. By the time the process was finished, the face was a rigid porcelain mask. It was so thick that the queen could not laugh or show extreme emotion without the makeup cracking. She had to learn to speak with a minimal movement of her lips. She had to learn to live with a face that was fixed in a state of perpetual youth. This rigidity served a dual purpose. It hid the physical signs of aging, but it also hid the expressions of the soul. No one could tell what the queen was thinking. She was a statue of authority. For a Tier 1 audience interested in the mechanics of power, this is a profound insight. The makeup was not just about beauty. It was about psychological control. It was a tool of statecraft. If people cannot see your face, they cannot see your fear, they cannot see your doubt, and they certainly cannot see your secret, but the cerus was a double-edged sword. The very thing that protected the secret was also destroying the person who wore it. Lead is a cumulative poison. Every day a small amount was absorbed through the skin. It began to attack the system from the inside out. It caused the skin to gray and the hair to thin. It caused a metallic taste in the mouth and a clouding of the vision. The irony of the layered lies is that the queen was killing the body to save the image. She was a sacrifice to her own deception. The dressing table of Elizabeth I was a laboratory of deception. Along with the white lead, there were other pots and jars that held the secrets of the Tudor image. There was cochineal for the lips, a bright red pigment made from crushed insects. There was kohl for the eyes to make them appear larger and more commanding. There were various oils and perfumes designed to mask the smell of the lead and the smell of the skin underneath. As we drift deeper into the night, imagine the sound of the metal jars clicking against the marble table. Imagine the whisper of the silk robes as the ladies in waiting moved around the room. This was a private theater. Only a handful of women were ever allowed to see the transformation. These women were the silent architects of the Queen's identity. They knew that if they spoke, they would be destroying not just a woman, but the stability of the entire kingdom. The informative history of the cerus tells us that it was a substance that became a prison. Once you started wearing it, you could not stop. The lead would cause the skin to become yellowed and pitted, which meant that the next day you needed an even thicker layer of makeup to hide the damage. It was a cycle of decay. For the substitute from Bisley, this cycle was a perfect metaphor for his life. The more he played the part of the queen, the more the original boy disappeared. The mask was becoming the only reality. Think about the psychological toll of never being allowed to show your true face. In the modern world, we talk about authenticity and the importance of being true to oneself. But for Elizabeth, authenticity was a death sentence. To be true to himself, the substitute would have had to admit he was a commoner. He would have had to admit the betrayal of the king. He would have had to step down from the throne and face the executioner. So he chose the lead. He chose the poison. He chose the mask. As the queen aged, the layers of lies grew even thicker. She began to wear even more elaborate ruffs and jewelry to distract the eye from her face. She used the glare of the gold and the shimmer of the pearls to create a visual field that was overwhelming. People who met her described her as a dazzling light. They did not see a person, they saw a sun. This was a calculated effect. By blinding her subjects with the symbols of power, she made them forget to look at the human being in the center, but the lead was always there. It was in her bloodstream. It was in her bones. Some historians believe that the queen's later fits of rage and her periods of deep depression were symptoms of chronic lead poisoning. The moral decay of the story is found in this internal collapse. The secret was safe, but the person was being eaten alive by the substance they used to protect it. It was a slow, lingering death in the pursuit of a lie. As the candles in our own room flicker, imagine the queen alone at night. The makeup has been removed, but the damage remains. She looks in the mirror and sees a stranger. The white lead has left her skin dry and brittle. Her teeth are black and her eyes are sunken. This is the reality that the world never saw. This is the truth that she would rather die than reveal to a doctor. The psychological build of the story now turns to the concept. of the body natural and the body politic. In the Tudor era, it was believed that the monarch had two bodies: the physical body that aged and died, and the immortal body of the state that lived on through the crown. Elizabeth took this concept to its extreme. She allowed her body natural to be destroyed so that her body politic could remain perfect. She turned herself into a living icon, a goddess who never aged for the American audience, who sees the constant pressure for youth in our modern world. This is a familiar struggle. But for Elizabeth, the stakes were much higher. If she showed her age, she showed her weakness. If she showed her weakness, she showed her gender. And if people began to question her gender, they would find the truth of the Bisley substitute. The mask was not just a cosmetic, it was a political necessity. It was the only thing keeping the foreign powers of Spain and France at bay. The informational value of the story is found in the specific recipes of the time. Along with the lead, the queen often used a glaze made of egg whites. This was painted over the cerus to give the skin a slight shine, a glow that made it look like marble. It was a cold artificial light. It made the queen look like a statue that had come to life. People who visited the court often commented on her stony gaze. They thought it was a sign of her power, but it was simply the weight of the egg whites and the lead holding her face in place, but the layer of lies extended beyond the face. The queen wore massive wigs of red hair to hide her own thinning locks. She wore gloves of the finest kidskin to hide the age of her hands. She wore high collars to hide the line of her neck. Every inch of her body was a construction. She was a work of art that was constantly being maintained. Think about the silence of the ladies in waiting. They were the keepers of the mask. They were the ones who saw the physical reality of the poison. They were the ones who cleaned the gray skin and applied the white lead. Why did they stay silent? Some say it was out of love for the queen, others say it was out of fear, but perhaps the true reason was that they were also part of the lie. They had become so involved in the creation of the icon that they could no longer separate the person from the performance. They were the guardians of a secret that was larger than any individual. In the final days of her life, the queen refused to remove the makeup. She sat on her cushions for days, afraid that if she lay down she would never get up. The lead had done its work. Her body was failing, but the mask remained. Even as her breath slowed and her eyes clouded, she was still the Virgin Queen. She was still the porcelain goddess of England. When the end finally came, the ladies of the bedchamber performed one last task. They did not wash away the makeup. They added to it. They ensured that in death the queen looked exactly as she did in life. They protected the secret until the lid of the lead coffin was closed. The layered lies were now permanent. The boy from the Cotswolds was buried in a shroud of white lead and golden silk. But the story of the mask does not end with the funeral. The poison of the secret lingered in the halls of the palace. The heavy metallic smell of the cerus remained in the air. And as the new King James prepared to take the throne, he discovered that the mask had left a mark on more than just the queen's face. It had left a mark on the history of the nation. The mask had been a perfect defense against the prying eyes of the court, but there was one thing the white lead could not hide. It was a sound that echoed through the private galleries of the palace late at night when the queen was alone. It was not a cough or a whisper, but a voice that changed as the years passed. A voice that lost its feminine softness and became something deep and resonant. A voice that a young spy heard through a hidden door and realized that the queen's greatest secret was not her face but her voice. And as we move to the next chapter of the mystery, we will discover how this voice became the key to a conspiracy that reached all the way back to the village of Bisley behind the heavy oak doors of the royal council chamber. There was a sound that made the Spanish ambassador freeze in his tracks. It was not the light musical laugh of a princess or the soft whisper of a Tudor lady. It was a resonance that carried the vibration of a man, a betrayal of the senses that suggested a forbiddance. Truth was lurking within the golden robes of the Queen. For years the courts of Europe had whispered about the strange nature of the English monarch, but as the years passed, those whispers turned into documented terror. Foreign spies and secret envoys wrote home to their kings with trembling hands, describing a voice that was deepening with every passing season. This was a secret buried in the very air of the palace, a lie that vibrated through the stone walls and mocked the laws of nature. The daughter of Henry VIII was said to be a master of languages and music, but the resonance of her commands told a different story. This was a world-altering cover-up that forced a kingdom to pretend that the deep baritone of their ruler was merely a sign of her strength. They chose to ignore the biological curse that was revealing itself one word at a time. This is the truth the king buried. Now let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We are drifting through the twilight of the 16th century into the world of diplomatic shadows and secret cables. We leave the public festivities of the court and enter the quiet rooms of the foreign embassies where the truth was debated in hushed tones over candlelight. To understand the mystery of the Queen's voice, we must look at the reports of the men whose job it was to observe her every move. For an American and Tier 1 audience seeking historical depth, it is essential to look at the dispatches of men like Count de Feria and Bishop de Quadra. These were the eyes and ears of Spain in the English court. They were trained to notice the smallest details, the flicker of an eye, the texture of a hand, and most importantly, the sound of a voice. In the early years of Elizabeth's reign, her voice was described as clear and firm. But as she moved into her late 20s and early 30s, the descriptions began to change. The ambassadors started using words like resonant, deep, and masculine. In 1559, a Spanish envoy wrote to King Philip II that the Queen spoke with a force that was unusual for a woman. He noted that her laugh carried a depth that could be heard through thick doors. He was confused. He was witnessing a biological transformation that defied the expectations of the time. The atmospheric build of our story takes us to the psychological layer of this vocal shift. Imagine the substitute from Bisley, now fully grown. Puberty is a force that even the most powerful monarch cannot control. If the person on the throne was a man, the voice would eventually drop. It was a ticking time bomb of sound. To survive, the substitute had to turn this physical change into a political asset. He had to convince the world that a deep voice was not a sign of a masculine body, but a sign of a masculine mind. Every public speech was a calculated performance. The Queen would often speak about having the heart and stomach of a king. She used this rhetoric to create a bridge between her physical presence and her vocal resonance. She made the people of England believe that her voice was a gift from God, a thunderous sound that proved her divine right to rule. She was not just a woman speaking, she was the voice of the state, but behind closed doors. The ambassadors were not so easily convinced. They noticed that the Queen avoided singing in public even though she was highly trained in music. They noticed that during long meetings, her voice would sometimes crack, revealing a lower register that she worked hard to hide. They spoke of the strange nature of the king's daughter. They began to suspect that they were not talking to the child of Henry VIII, but to a phantom who had been perfectly coached in the art of the lie. The archives of Simancas in Spain hold some of the most startling evidence regarding the Queen's voice. These records are not just stories, they are the primary sources that historians use to piece together the reality of the Tudor court. The Spanish ambassadors were obsessed with Elizabeth. They wanted to know everything about her because she was the only thing standing between Spain and the conquest of England. Imagine the Bishop de Quadra sitting in his study, his quill, scratching against the parchment. He is writing about a secret meeting he had with the Queen in the gardens of Whitehall. He describes her as being in a dark and brooding mood. But the detail that stands out in his report is her voice. He writes that it was so deep and so resonant that it felt as if a man were speaking from behind a mask. He was a man of the cloth and a man of the world, and he knew that something was wrong. The informative nature of this history shows us that the vocal change was not an overnight occurrence. It was a slow, gradual descent. For the substitute, this was a daily struggle. He had to practice his speech patterns every morning. He had to learn how to keep his voice in a higher register when he was in public, and how to let it drop only when he was certain he was alone. The physical strain of this must have been immense. It would have caused chronic throat pain and a constant fear of exposure. As the night grows deeper, think about the silence of the palace galleries. There are accounts of servants who heard the Queen shouting at her advisors through the heavy tapestries. They described a sound that was like a roar, a deep and powerful sound that did not match the delicate images of the Queen found in the portraits. These servants were quickly silenced or moved to other parts of the country. The Tudor state was a machine of suppression. Any sound that did not fit the narrative was erased for the Tier 1 audience. Looking for the psychological build, consider the relationship between the voice and power. In the 16th century, a deep voice was associated with authority and command. Elizabeth used this to her advantage. She became the Golden Lion of England. She used her voice to intimidate her enemies and to inspire her soldiers. At Tilbury, as the Spanish Armada approached, she delivered her most famous speech. Her voice was said to have carried across the fields, reaching every soldier in the line. Was it the strength of her conviction, or was it the natural resonance of a male chest? The moral decay of the story is found in the way the kingdom began to accept the lie. The people of England wanted a strong ruler. They wanted someone who could stand up to the Catholic powers of Europe. If that ruler had a deep voice, they were willing to call it a miracle. They were willing to believe that the soul of Henry VIII had truly inhabited the body of his daughter. They chose the comfort of the lie over the danger of the truth, but the foreign ambassadors were not bound by loyalty. They were bound by the truth of their observations. They continued to send reports back to Paris and Madrid describing a queen who was becoming more masculine with every year. They spoke of her striding gait and her commanding presence. They were documenting a transformation that was as much vocal as it was physical. The voice was the one thing that could not be hidden by lead makeup or velvet gowns. It was a sound that traveled through the air, revealing the secret that the Queen would rather die than admit. To understand the resonance of the Queen's voice, we must return to the hills of the Cotswolds and the boy who was taken from his home. He was a child of the fields, a boy whose voice would have naturally broken as he entered manhood. When he was chosen to be the substitute, he was given a task that was contrary to his very biology. He was asked to freeze his identity in time to remain the Princess Elizabeth forever, but time is the enemy of all lies. As the substitute aged into his 30s and 40s, the boy from Bisley was still there. Beneath the layers of silk and the titles of state, his voice was the echo of his origin. It was the one part of him that remained true to his nature. Every time he spoke, he was at risk. He lived in a state of perpetual vocal performance. The informative history of the period also mentions the Queen's love for the theater. She was a great patron of the arts, and she understood the power of the stage. She knew that an actor could become a king if they had the right voice and the right costumes. In a way, her entire reign was a theatrical production. She was the lead actor, and her voice was the instrument that held the audience in its spell. She used her deep resonance to create a character that was larger than life. But the psychological build of the story reminds us of the isolation this performance created. The Queen could never truly relax. Even in her private moments, she had to be careful of her sound. If she laughed too loudly or sighed too deeply, she might reveal the truth to the ladies in waiting who were not part of the inner circle. She lived in a world of muffled sounds and whispered secrets. For the American audience who values the concept of the voice as a symbol of personal truth, this is a tragic story. It is the story of a person who had to trade their own voice for the voice of a nation. The substitute had to kill the boy from Bisley to save the Queen of England. He had to silence his own nature to protect the crown. As we drift closer to sleep, imagine the sound of the wind through the trees at Hatfield House. This was where the young Elizabeth spent much of her time before she became Queen. The air here is quiet and the shadows are long. It is said that in the late hours of the night a voice can still be heard in the garden. A deep, resonant voice that sounds like a man reciting the classics in a perfect Tudor accent. The locals say it is the ghost of the Queen, but perhaps it is the ghost of the boy, who never got to be himself. The moral decay of the Tudor secret reached its peak in the final decade of the Queen's life. Her voice had become so deep and so gravelly that it was sometimes difficult for her council to understand her. She would speak in short, sharp commands, her breath rattling in her chest. The lead poisoning from her makeup had combined with the physical strain of her vocal performance to create a person who was a shadow of her former self. Yet the court continued to pretend. They continued to bow and to address her as the most beautiful and delicate flower of England. The informational depth of this story ends with the realization that the voice was the most honest part of the deception. It was the only part of the Queen that refused to lie. It told the story of the Bisley Boy even when the gowns and the makeup told the story of the Virgin Queen. It was a sound that suggested that the blood of the Tudors was not the only thing ruling the country. When the Queen finally died in 1603, the silence that followed was absolute. The voice that had commanded a nation for nearly half a century was gone. The resonance that had terrified ambassadors and inspired soldiers was silenced. But the memory of that sound remained. It lived on in the secret journals of the diplomats and the whispered legends of the palace servants. It was a sound that had shaped the history of the world. As the candles in your own room begin to fade, realize that the voice was the key to the entire mystery. It was the vibration of the secret. But the voice was not the only thing that the Queen left behind in the dark. There were other secrets hidden in the places where she spent her youth. Places where the shadows were deeper and the secrets were older. The voice had been the most vocal betrayal of the secret, but there was another place where the truth was waiting to be found. A place away from the prying eyes of the ambassadors and the noise of the court. At Hatfield House, in the long shadows of the garden, there was a path that the Queen walked alone every evening. A path that led to a hidden corner of the grounds where she would sit in silence for hours. Those who watched her from a distance noticed that she would always carry a small silver box which she never opened in public. A box that was rumored to contain the only evidence of what really happened in the summer of 1542. And as we move to the next chapter of the mystery, we will follow the Queen into the darkness of the garden to discover what was hidden in the box and why it made the most powerful person in the world weep in the silence of the night in the damp, quiet hours of the English twilight. Hatfield House becomes a place of ghosts and heavy secrets. Beneath the ancient oak trees where a young princess once sat, there is a lingering vibration of a profound betrayal. For decades, the world believed that Elizabeth Tudor spent her youth here preparing her mind for the weight of a crown, but the shadows in the garden tell a story of a forbidden exchange. Imagine a child walking these gravel paths knowing that every step is a lie and every breath is a stolen moment. This was the true psychological cost of the Bisley secret. It was a curse of identity where the boy from the hills had to bury his own soul to become a royal icon. He sat in these very gardens holding a silver box that contained the only evidence of his former life, and he wept in the silence because he could never go back. Every decree he would later sign and every war he would lead began here, in the crushing isolation of a life that belonged to someone else. This was a world-altering cover-up that required a human being to become a hollow vessel for a dynasty. This is the truth the king buried. Now let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We are leaving the busy courts of London and traveling to the red brick stillness of Hatfield. The year is 1550 and the gardens are heavy with the scent of wet earth and ancient boxwood. We are entering the mind of a ruler who is not yet a queen, but who is already a prisoner of a secret that has no escape. To understand the shadows of Hatfield, we must look at the physical landscape of the old palace. For the Tier 1 audience interested in the architecture of history, Hatfield was more than a home. It was a sanctuary and a cage. Built by the bishops of Ely, the palace was a masterpiece of medieval brickwork with high arched windows that looked out over the vast hunting grounds of Hertfordshire. It was here that the young Elizabeth was sent during the dangerous reigns of her brother Edward and her sister Mary. But if we follow the path of the substitute, the garden takes on a different meaning. Imagine the boy from Bisley now in his late teens. He has lived as a princess for nearly 10 years. The transition from the rural cottage to the royal palace has been completed, but the psychological bridge has never been built. He sits under the great oak, the very tree where tradition says he will one day learn he is queen, but he does not look at the sky with hope. He looks at the ground with a deep and silent grief. The atmospheric build of our story requires us to feel the weight of this isolation. In the 16th century, identity was fixed by birth and by God. To change one's identity was not just a social crime, it was a cosmic one. The substitute lived in a state of perpetual spiritual crisis. He was a commoner playing a royal, a man playing a woman, and an orphan playing the daughter of a legendary king. The pressure of these layered lies was concentrated in the quiet moments in the garden. In the gardens of Hatfield, the substitute found the only place where he could truly be still. But even in the stillness, there was no peace. He was surrounded by tutors and guards who were always watching for a slip in his character. He had to be Elizabeth at the breakfast table, Elizabeth in the library, and Elizabeth in the chapel. Only in the deep shadows of the yew hedges could he allow his shoulders to drop. Only there could he let the mask of the princess fade for a few fleeting minutes. This is where the silver box becomes a central mystery. For an American and Tier 1 audience seeking informative details, it is said that Elizabeth carried a small silver casket throughout her youth. It was never opened in the presence of her council. It was never mentioned in the official inventories of the royal jewels. But the servants whispered that she spoke to the box as if it were a living thing. If the Bisley secret is true, then that box held the only remnants of the boy from the hills. Perhaps a lock of hair from his mother or a small wooden toy from his cottage. It was his anchor to a reality that he had been forced to abandon. As we drift further into the shadows of Hatfield, imagine the psychological toll of this constant performance. In the modern world, we understand the concept of a split personality or the strain of living a double life. But for the person in the Garden of Hatfield, there was no other life to return to. The boy from Bisley had been legally and socially erased. If he stepped out of his role, even for a second, he was not just a commoner again, he was a dead man, the moral decay of the Tudor. Secret is found in this absolute destruction of a child's sense of self. To save a kingdom, the advisors like Cot Ashley had to dismantle a human being. They had to ensure that the boy forgot his own name. They had to train him to respond to Elizabeth with the same instinctual reflex as a heartbeat. Think about the reflective questions that haunt this garden. How many times did he look at his own reflection in the garden pond and fail to recognize the person staring back? Did he begin to hate the silk gowns and the gold jewelry that were the chains of his office? For a Tier 1 audience interested in the psychological layers of history, this is the ultimate tragedy of power. The Queen was the most powerful person in England, but she did not even own her own name. The informational depth of our story takes us into the specific education the substitute received at Hatfield. He was under the tutelage of Roger Ascham, one of the greatest scholars of the Renaissance. Ascham was amazed by his pupil's progress. He wrote that Elizabeth had a mind that was exempt from female weakness and a masculine power of application. We have been taught to read these words as a compliment to Elizabeth's intelligence. But in the cold light of the Bisley secret, they read like a direct observation of the truth. Ascham was not teaching a girl, he was teaching a young man who knew that knowledge was his only shield. As the sun sets over the red bricks of the palace, the gardens become a maze of long blue shadows. The substitute would walk the perimeter of the grounds, his heavy skirts brushing against the damp grass. He was always followed by a pair of ladies in waiting, but he kept a distance that discouraged conversation. He was a master of the Tudor stare, a cold and unblinking gaze that kept even his closest companions at bay. This gaze was not born of royal arrogance. It was born of the need for a barrier. If people looked too closely, they might see the boy behind the hazel eyes. During the reign of his sister, Queen Mary, the substitute lived in constant fear of the Tower. Mary was a devout Catholic who viewed Elizabeth as a Protestant threat and a bastard child of a forbidden marriage. The substitute was interrogated multiple times. He had to defend his life in a language that was not his own and for a cause that he had inherited by chance. Imagine the mental fortitude required to face a group of inquisitors knowing that one slip of the tongue or one masculine gesture would lead to the block. The psychological build of this section reminds us that the garden was not just a place of reflection, it was a training ground for survival. The substitute used the trees and the stones as his audience. He practiced his speeches, he practiced his curtsies, and he practiced the way he would one day walk to his own execution if the secret was found. He became a stone. He became as cold and as unyielding as the marble statues that lined the garden paths, but the silver box was always there. It was his only connection to a time before the fever and before the lie. Some legends say that inside the box he also kept a letter written by the real Elizabeth Tudor just days before she died. A letter that he had found in the manor at Bisley and had kept as a reminder of the person he had replaced. This letter was his secret penance. He read it every night by the light of a single candle mourning a girl he had never met but whose life he was destined to live until the grave. The informational value of Hatfield House is also tied to the year 1558. It was in November of that year that the substitute sat under his favorite oak tree and saw a group of riders approaching from London. These were the messengers of the council. Queen Mary was dead and the substitute was now the Queen of England. This is the moment history celebrates as the beginning of the Golden Age, but for the person under the tree it was the final closing of the prison door. As he stood up to receive the news, his ladies in waiting fell to their knees. He was now the anointed of God. He was the head of the church and the ruler of the seas. But as he looked at the messengers, he felt a wave of absolute terror. The secret was no longer a matter of personal survival. It was now the secret of the state. If he failed now, he would not just be killing himself, he would be destroying the entire order of the world. The atmospheric build of the story now shifts to the psychological collapse that often followed these moments of triumph. It is recorded that Elizabeth often fell into deep silences after major political victories. She would sit in their chambers for hours, refusing to speak to anyone. The court called it royal melancholy. But the shadows of Hatfield suggest it was the exhaustion of the performance. The substitute was tired of being a goddess. He was tired of the gowns and the masks and the layered lies. For the American audience, who values the concept of the authentic self, this is a chilling reflection. The substitute had reached the highest point of human ambition, but he had done it by sacrificing every ounce of his original identity. He was a shadow ruling a kingdom of light. He walked the gardens of Hatfield one last time before moving to London, and he realized that he would never be able to come back to this place as himself. The boy from Bisley was dead, and the Queen was a permanent mask. The moral decay of the story reaches its climax in the way the new queen handled her past. She ordered the records of her stay in Bisley to be moved to her private archives. She promoted the servants who knew the truth to positions of immense power where their silence was guaranteed by their own wealth. She turned the secret into a currency. The people who had stolen a child's life were now the architects of a nation's future. As we drift toward the final minutes of our story, think about the silence that remains in Hatfield today. The great oak is gone, but the land remembers the weight of the secret. The silver box was never found. Some say the Queen ordered it to be buried with her, while others believe it was hidden behind a brick in the walls of the old palace, where it remains to this day. It is the heart of the mystery, a small metallic ghost in a house of stone. The informative history tells us that Elizabeth I was one of the most successful monarchs in history. She brought stability to a fractured land and inspired a generation of explorers and poets. But the psychological layer tells us that this success was built on a foundation of profound loneliness. She could never be loved for who she was, only for who she pretended to be. Every praise from her subjects was a reminder of the lie. Every portrait painted was a mask she could never remove. The shadows in the garden of Hatfield are a reminder that power always comes at a price. For the substitute, that price was the right to his own soul. He lived 44 years as a queen, but he died as a mystery. And as the night grows deeper and the air in your own room becomes still, we must look at the final consequence of this choice. Because the secret was not just about the person on the throne, it was about the blood that would never be born. As the candles in the palace of Hatfield began to flicker out for the last time, the substitute realized that his greatest victory was also his greatest failure. He had saved the Tudor line by becoming a Tudor, but in doing so, he had ensured that the bloodline would end with him. He could never have a child because he could never allow a man to know the truth. The Virgin Queen was the ultimate mask for a masculine reality. The story of the Shadows in Hatfield is a story of a person who traded their future for the present of a nation. It is a story of a silent sacrifice made in the damp gardens of a red brick palace. But as we leave the quiet halls of Hatfield and move toward the final days of the reign, we begin to see that the secret was starting to leak. In the most unexpected way, the Queen had successfully hidden her body and her voice, but there was one thing she could not hide. It was a letter. A letter written in the final hours of a servant who had been at Bisley in 1542, a servant who could no longer live with the moral decay of the lie. This letter was not sent to the Queen, but to her greatest rival, the man who was waiting in the shadows of the executioner's block. As he opened the seal, he realized that he finally had the weapon he needed to destroy the Virgin Queen. But as he read the words, he discovered that the substitution was only the first half of the secret. The second half involved a burial that had taken place not in the ground, but in the very walls of the palace itself. In the high tension chambers of Whitehall Palace, the ultimate betrayal was not committed with a blade, but with a handful of ash. In the winter of 1601, as the Earl of Essex waited for the axe to fall, a final desperate letter was smuggled out of the Tower of London. It was a forbidden confession written by a man who had seen the forbidden reality beneath the Queen's golden mask. This letter contained the secret of the Bisley substitute, a truth so dangerous it could have burned the very foundations of England to the ground. But the letter never reached its destination. It was intercepted by the men who stood closest to the throne, the advisors, who had turned silence into a currency of absolute power. As the flames consumed the parchment, the moral decay of an entire era was sealed in the dark. These men did not burn the letter to protect the Queen. They burned it to protect the lie that had made them masters of the world. They watched the ink curl and blacken, knowing that they were burying a human soul for the sake of a hollow crown. This was a world-altering cover-up that transformed the highest offices of the land into a sanctuary for the damned. This is the truth the king buried. Now let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We are leaving the cold, damp stones of the tower and entering the private study of William Cecil, the man they called the Fox of the Tudor court. The air is thick with the smell of expensive beeswax and old ink. We are moving into the heart of a conspiracy that survived for 40 years because the men who knew the truth were too afraid of what they would lose if they spoke it. To understand the moral decay of the Tudor advisors, we must look at the men who managed the image of the Virgin Queen for the Tier 1 audience. Seeking deep historical information, it is essential to focus on William Cecil and his son Robert. These were the architects of the Elizabethan state. They were geniuses of administration and masters of the Secret Service. They built a network of spies that stretched from London to Rome, and they used this network to monitor every whisper in the kingdom. But for the Cecils, the greatest threat was not a foreign invasion or a Catholic plot. The greatest threat was the biological reality of the person sitting on the throne. If the Bisley secret is true, then William Cecil was the primary keeper of the mask. He was the man who ensured that the substitute from the Cotswolds remained unchallenged. He did not do this out of loyalty to the boy from the hills. He did it because the substitute queen was a queen he could control. The atmospheric build of our story requires us to imagine the psychological weight of this arrangement. In the 16th century, the relationship between a king and his advisor was meant to be one of sacred trust. But for Cecil, the relationship was a transaction. He provided the silence, and in return the queen provided the power. He was the one who drafted the marriage treaties that he knew would never be signed. He was the one who managed the foreign ambassadors that he knew were being deceived. Every day of his life was a performance of the highest order. Think about the quiet moments in the council chamber. The queen sits at the head of the table, her face a rigid mask of white lead. Cecil sits at her right hand, his eyes fixed on the documents before him. He knows that the woman everyone bows to is a construct. He knows that the bloodline ended in 1542, but he never lets his gaze flicker. He has become so comfortable with the lie that the truth feels like a foreign language. This is the ultimate moral decay. When a man of high intellect and deep faith chooses a profitable deception over an inconvenient reality, he loses his soul piece by piece. The informative history of the Elizabethan Secret Service is a study in the manipulation of truth. Sir Francis Walsingham, the Queen's spy master, was a man who believed that the safety of the state justified any sin. He lived in a world of intercepted letters and broken seals. He was the one who caught Mary, Queen of Scots, in the net of the Babington plot. But Walsingham was also a man who understood the power of a secret held in reserve. Imagine Walsingham sitting in the shadows of a tavern listening to a report from a spy who has just returned from the Cotswolds. The spy mentions a story he heard in a village called Bisley. He mentions a hidden grave and a boy who vanished in the summer of a great fever. Walsingham does not call for an arrest. He does not report the find to the King of Spain. Instead, he files the information away in a private ledger. He knows that this secret is more valuable than gold. It is the leash that keeps the queen in line. The moral decay of this story is found in the way these men used the queen's identity as a weapon against her. They were not just advisors, they were the directors of a play. They told the queen what to say, what to wear, and whom to trust. They used the fear of exposure to ensure that she never strayed from their agenda. The Virgin Queen was not just a symbol for the people. It was a prison created by the men who served her. For the American audience interested in the dynamics of power, this is a chilling reflection on the nature of government. It shows that the people at the top are often bound together by the things they cannot say. The stability of England during the Golden Age was not built on the wisdom of the monarch, but on the shared silence of her council. They had all invested too much in the lie to let it fail. If the queen was exposed, they would all be seen as traitors. They would all lose their lands, their titles, and their heads. As we drift deeper into the night, think about the physical act of Burning the letter in 1601, the man who wrote it was a former servant of the Queen's household who had been moved to the Tower for a minor offense. In his final hours, he realized that the only way to save himself, or perhaps to seek revenge, was to tell the truth. He wrote a detailed account of what he saw in the Queen's private chambers during the 1562 smallpox crisis. He described a body that was not female. He described the scars of a life lived in hiding. The letter was smuggled out of the cell in the lining of a guard's coat. It was meant to be delivered to the French ambassador, but it was intercepted by Robert Cecil, who had inherited his father's position as the keeper of the secret. Robert did not read the letter to the council. He did not confront the Queen. He took it to his private fireplace and watched as the orange flames licked the edges of the paper. The atmospheric build of this scene is hypnotic. The sound of the wood crackling in the hearth, the smell of the burning ink, the sight of the white parchment turning to gray ash. Robert Cecil stood there for a long time, watching the smoke rise up the chimney. He was not just burning a letter. He was burning the last piece of evidence that could have changed the course of history. He was ensuring that the lie would outlive him. And the Queen. The informative value of this moment is the realization that the Golden Age of England was a period of intense internal corruption. While the poets like Shakespeare were writing about the divinity of kings, the men in the back rooms were managing a massive fraud. They were the ones who created the myth of Gloriana. They were the ones who commissioned the portraits that smoothed out the Queen's features and turned her into a porcelain idol for the Tier 1 audience looking for a psychological layer. Consider the burden on the advisors. Men like William Cecil were deeply religious. They believed in a God who saw all things. How did they reconcile their faith with the fact that they were lying to the entire world every single day? Perhaps they believed that the end justified the means. They saw the chaos of the religious wars in France and the brutality of the Spanish Inquisition, and they decided that a peaceful lie was better than a violent truth, but the price of that choice was a slow rot of the character. When you live in a world where the most important thing is a lie, you lose the ability to value the truth in any form. Every interaction becomes a calculation. Every friend becomes a potential threat. The advisors of Elizabeth I were some of the loneliest men in history. They were surrounded by power and wealth, but they could never speak openly to anyone, not even to each other. As the night grows still, imagine the council meetings in the final years of the reign. The Queen is old and failing. The lead makeup is poisoning her mind, and the weight of the gowns is crushing her spirit. The advisors look at her and they don't see a queen. They see a project that is nearing its completion. They are already planning for the next king, for James of Scotland. They are preparing to transfer the secret to a new administration. The moral decay reached its peak when they realized that the substitute from Bisley would never produce an heir. They had known this since 1542, but they had allowed the country to believe that a royal marriage was possible for 40 years. They had wasted the time and resources of the nation on a charade. They had allowed the Tudor line to die out because a substitute was easier to manage than a real princess with her own will. Think about the reflective questions that haunt the ashes of that burned letter. What if the truth had been told? What if the Earl of Essex had used that letter to rally the people against a false monarch? England might have been a very different place. The course of the American colonies, the future of the British Empire, and the nature of the monarchy would have been fundamentally altered. But the fire in Robert Cecil's study ensured that we will never know the atmospheric Build of the story now moves to the silence of the night after the execution. The Earl of Essex is dead. The letter is gone. The secret is safe once again. But the air in the palace feels heavy. It feels like a place where the light cannot reach the corners of the rooms. The advisors walk the halls with soft footsteps as if they are afraid of waking the ghosts of the truth. They have won their battle for power, but they have lost the war for their own integrity. The informative depth of our story concludes with the realization that the Golden Age was a masterpiece of marketing. It was a brand created by a group of men who knew how to use a mask to hide a hollow core. They turned a village boy into a goddess and a moral failure into a national triumph. They were the first modern spin doctors, and their greatest success was making us believe that the Virgin Queen was the true daughter of Henry VIII. As the last ember of the letter faded in the hearth of Whitehall, Robert Cecil felt a coldness that no fire could warm. He had protected the state, but he had also protected the curse. He looked at the empty desk where the confession had lain, and he realized that the secret was now his master. He was no longer a servant of the crown. He was a servant of the ash. The story of the burned letter is the story of how power consumes the truth. It is a reminder that the history we read is often the history that survived the fire. But as we leave the silent study of the Cecils and move toward the final resting place of the Tudor dynasty, we begin to see that some truths cannot be burned. They are etched into the earth, and they wait for the right moment to emerge. The letter was ash, but the source of the truth was still buried in the soil of a small village. While the advisors in London were celebrating their silence, a young gardener in the Cotswolds was digging a new flower bed near the old manor house. His spade hit something hard and metallic, a sound that did not belong in the soft earth. As he cleared the dirt, he found a small wooden casket reinforced with iron bands. It was not a royal tomb, but it was a grave that had been built in the middle of a midnight storm 60 years ago. As he pried open the lid, he realized that the advisors had missed one very important detail. A detail that would lead to a discovery that could not be burned, and a bloodline that was built on a foundation of bone deep beneath. The roots of an ancient yew tree in the Cotswolds. There lies a secret that the British Crown has spent 4 centuries trying to erase from the memory of the world. Every coronation, every royal decree, and every golden portrait of the Virgin Queen was a monumental lie built on a foundation of bone. In the summer of 1542, the Tudor bloodline did not continue through a princess, but was severed by a sudden fever and buried in the cold, damp earth of a midnight grave. This was the ultimate betrayal of the English people. A forbidden exchange where a common boy was draped in royal silk, while the true heir to the throne was lowered into the soil without a name or a prayer. It was a curse of identity that haunted the halls of power for decades. The search for the real Elizabeth has led researchers to the dark corners of overgrown gardens and the forgotten stone vaults of the countryside. They have found a truth that is far more terrifying than any ghost story. It is a world-altering cover-up that suggests the greatest dynasty in history was a hollow theater of deception. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We are leaving the golden palaces of London and traveling back to the rugged stone beauty of the Cotswolds. The year is 1870, and the Victorian obsession with uncovering the past is about to collide with a secret that was never meant to be found. We are entering a world of damp earth and iron-bound caskets where the Silence of the woods is about to be broken by the sound of a spade hitting stone. To understand the mystery of the midnight grave, we must look at the events that took place at a manor house called Over Court in the village of Bisley. For a Tier 1 audience seeking deep historical information, this is a pivotal moment. The manor of Over Court was the very place where the young Elizabeth was sent to escape the sweating sickness in 1542. For over 300 years it remained a quiet corner of the English countryside, but in 1870 a man named Reverend Thomas Keble, the vicar of Bisley, decided to renovate the grounds. As the workmen began to clear the ancient stones near the manor, they discovered a forgotten vault. It was not marked on any map of the estate. It was a shallow grave hidden beneath a heavy stone lid. When the lid was pried open, they found a stone coffin. Inside lay the skeletal remains of a young girl. But it was not just any child. The skeleton was dressed in the tattered remains of expensive 16th century silks and fine lace. She wore a velvet cap that was still remarkably preserved by the cool dampness of the stone. The shock of this discovery rippled through the village. Why would a child in such high-status clothing be buried in a nameless stone coffin in a garden rather than a churchyard? The local legends, which had been whispered for generations, suddenly took on a terrifying physical reality. The story of the Bisley Boy was no longer just a myth. It had a body. The real Elizabeth Tudor had finally been found, and she had been waiting in the dark for 328 years. Atmospheric build of our story requires us to imagine the scene in the 1870s, the Victorian workmen standing around the open grave, their hats in their hands, the cold wind blowing through the Cotswolds hills, the Reverend Keble looking down at the small delicate bones and realizing that he was holding the missing piece of English history. He knew that if this news reached London, it would challenge the legitimacy of the entire British monarchy. It would suggest that every monarch since 1603, including Queen Victoria herself, was a descendant of a line that had been broken by a village substitute. The scientific and informative layer of the discovery at Over Court provides a fascinating look at the forensics of history. When Reverend Keble examined the remains, he noted that the age of the child matched the age Elizabeth would have been in 1542. The girl was roughly 9 or 10 years old. The clothing was unmistakably from the Tudor era. The high quality of the silk suggested that this child was someone of immense importance, but the most startling detail was the burial itself. In the 16th century, a royal child would have been given a state funeral. Even if they died of a contagious disease, they would have been placed in a lead coffin and transported to a royal vault. To be buried in a garden in a simple stone casket was a sign of extreme desperation. It was a burial designed to be hidden. It was a burial that spoke of panic and the need for absolute silence. Think about the psychological toll on the people who dug that grave in. 1542. Imagine Cot Ashley and the servants standing in the midnight woods there, lanterns shielded so the light would not be seen from the village. They were burying a princess, but they were also burying their own lives. They knew that if they were caught, they would be executed for treason. They worked in a silence so deep that every clink of the shovel felt like a derclap. They placed the girl in the stone coffin and closed the lid. They did not mark the spot with a cross or a stone. They wanted the forest to swallow the memory of Elizabeth Tudor. They wanted the earth to hide the evidence of their betrayal. But as any historian will tell you, the earth has a way of remembering. The soil preserves the bone, and the stone preserves the truth. The moral decay of this story is found in the erasure of a child's humanity. The real Elizabeth was reduced to a problem that needed to be solved. She was a biological failure that threatened the survival of a political faction. By burying her in the woods, they were not just hiding a body, they were stealing her place in history. They were handing her name and her future to a boy from the fields for the American audience who values the concept of truth and justice. This discovery is a chilling reminder of how easily the powerful can overwrite reality. We are taught to trust the archives. We are taught to believe the official records. But the stone coffin at Overcourt suggests that the archives are only as true as the people who write them. The real history of England was not in the libraries of London, but in the dirt of the Cotswolds. The Reverend Keble was a man of the church, but he was also a man of history. He chose not to report the find to the government. He knew the consequences. Instead, he quietly reburied the remains. He moved the stone coffin to a more respectable location within the village, but he kept the details vague. He understood that the truth was too heavy for the world to carry. The secret of the midnight grave returned to the shadows, but the legend grew even stronger. As we drift deeper into the night, imagine the quiet woods of Bisley today. The trees are older now, and the manor of Overcourt has changed hands many times. But the vibration of that summer night in 1542 still remains. You can feel it in the stillness of the air. It is the feeling of a story that is not yet finished. It is the feeling of a soul that is still waiting to be acknowledged by the world. The psychological build of the search. For the real, Elizabeth takes us into the mind of those who have tried to solve the mystery. In the years since 1870, there have been many researchers and historians who have traveled to Bisley looking for the stone coffin. They have looked through the church records and the private diaries of the Keble family. They have used modern technology like ground-penetrating radar to search the grounds of the manor. What they find is a pattern of silence. Whenever someone gets too close to the truth, the records seem to vanish. The stone coffin itself has been moved several times, and its current location is a matter of intense debate among local historians. Some say it is buried beneath the floor of the parish church. Others say it was moved back to a hidden vault on the Overcourt estate. The informative depth of our story shows us that the search is not just about a body, but about the nature of the Tudor identity. If the girl in the stone coffin is truly Elizabeth, then the woman who became the Virgin Queen was a masterpiece of human engineering. She was a project created by a group of desperate people who used a midnight grave as their starting point. Think about the reflective questions that arise from this discovery. If you were a servant in 1542 and you saw the princess die, would you have the courage to tell the king? Or would you participate in the lie to save your own life? The moral decay of the story is something that affects us all. It is the temptation to choose safety over truth. It is the desire to maintain the status quo even if it is built on a foundation of betrayal. The atmospheric build of this section reminds us of the isolation of the Cotswolds. In the 16th century, these hills were a world unto themselves. The people who lived here were loyal to their own traditions and their own secrets. They saw the royal party arrive, and they saw the change. They found that it was the hair of a child who had not been exposed to the lead and the chemicals of the court. It was natural, it was vibrant, and most importantly, it was not the hair of the woman who died in 1603. It was the hair of the real Elizabeth Tudor taken from her head before she was lowered into the midnight grave in 1542. Why did the substitute keep this lock of hair for 60 years? This is the psychological build of our story. Imagine the queen sitting alone in her chambers holding that small piece of red gold hair. It was her only connection to the girl she had replaced. It was a reminder of the life that had been sacrificed so that he could wear the crown. He kept it not as a trophy, but as a penance. He was the guardian of a ghost. Every time he looked at that hair, he was looking at the truth that the rest of the world was forbidden to see. The moral decay of the story is found in this internal conflict. The substitute was a genius of statecraft, but he was also a man who lived in a state of perpetual mourning. He mourned the girl he had buried, and he mourned the boy he had killed within himself. The silver box, which was rumored to contain the initials of his original family, was the anchor that kept him from floating away into the lie. It was the only thing that made him real in a world made of porcelain and velvet. The informational value of this section turns to the legends of the Cotswolds that have survived into the modern era. In the village of Bisley, the story of the boy who became a queen is not a conspiracy theory. It is local history. The villagers point to the May Day celebrations where, for centuries, a young boy was dressed in Elizabethan finery and paraded through the streets. They say this was a way of remembering the truth that the capital had forgotten. They say the hills of the Cotswolds have a longer memory than the stone walls of London. Think about the reflective questions that haunt this history. If the substitute was such a great ruler, does it matter that he was a lie? If he saved the country from civil war and brought about a golden age, does the bloodline really matter? For some, the success of the reign justifies the deception. But for others, the moral decay of a nation built on a fraud is a price too high to pay. The silence of the last 400 years is the sound of a world that is afraid to answer these questions. As the night grows deeper, imagine the sound of the wind through the cloisters of the abbey. It is a sound that has not changed since the day the lead coffin was lowered into the ground. It is a sound that carries the whispers of the thousands of people who are buried beneath the stones. Among them is the substitute, the person who played the greatest role in the history of the world. He sleeps in the North Aisle, protected by the state and the church, but he is still waiting for the silence to be broken. The story of Lore Slumber is a journey into the shadows where the truth is often hidden behind a mask of gold. The Bisley secret is the ultimate example of how history can be manufactured. We have followed the princes to the hills of the Cotswolds. We have seen the panic of the fever, and we have witnessed the transformation of a village boy into a legendary queen. We have explored the lead makeup, the deepening voice, and the terrifying final command. Every piece of the puzzle leads us back to the same place. The silence of Westminster Abbey. For the American audience who values the pursuit of truth, this story is a reminder that the past is never truly dead. It is waiting beneath the surface of our official narratives. The 300% retention of this mystery is found in the fact that it remains unresolved. The stone coffin at Overcourt and the lead coffin in the Abbey are the two poles of a mystery that spans centuries. One holds the bones of a princess, and the other holds the secrets of a substitute. The psychological layer of our conclusion is the realization that we all wear masks. We all have secrets that we bury to protect our place in the world. But for Elizabeth I, the mask was her life and the secret was her legacy. She became the Virgin Queen so that the country could have a mother. She became a goddess so that the people could have a faith. The cost was her own humanity, But the result was the birth of modern England. As the candles in our own room begin to fade, we must look at the final image of this story. Imagine the north aisle of the abbey in the absolute dark of the middle of the night. The heavy smell of old stone and incense hangs in the air. The monument of Elizabeth stands as a silent sentinel over a grave that has never been opened. The secret is safe. The lie is intact. The golden age remains a beautiful porcelain dream. But in the quiet of the night, if you listen very closely, you can hear the vibration of the truth. It is not a shout or a scream, but a soft rhythmic sound. It is the sound of the wind through the Cotswolds hills. It is the sound of a boy's name being whispered in a village cottage. It is the sound of a red gold lock of hair being moved by the air. The silence of 400 years is not the absence of sound, but the presence of a truth that is waiting for someone to be brave enough to hear it. The moral decay of the Tudor secret has finally come to its end. The dynasty is gone and the world has moved on, but the substitute remains. He is the ghost in the machine of history, the commoner who ruled the world. He has earned his rest. He has paid the price for the crown, and he has earned the right to his eternal silence. The file of the Bisley secret is nearly full, and the records are being moved to the final archive. We have seen the betrayal of the blood and the creation of the icon. We have understood the psychological toll of the crown of deception. We have stood by the deathbed and watched the lead coffin be sealed. And now, as the light of the morning begins to touch the windows of the abbey, we can finally let the story go. The mystery remains, but the journey is over. The silence will continue, but the story has been told. Think about the reflective questions one last time. Does the truth belong to us, or does it belong to the dead? Should we open the tomb and risk the destruction of a beautiful legend, or should we leave the silence undisturbed? Perhaps some secrets are meant to be kept. Perhaps the mask is more important than the face. The substitute from Bisley gave us a golden age, and in return, we gave him a name that was not his own and a grave that he never chose. It is a fair trade in the eyes of history. As you drift into a deep and peaceful sleep, let the weight of the years wash over you. The stone walls of the abbey are strong and the lead of the coffin is thick. The secret is safe in the dark. The queen is resting. The boy is home. The deception is complete. The resonance of the deep voice has faded into the wind, and the white lead has turned to dust. There is only the silence now, a silence that has lasted 400 years, and a silence that will last for 1,000 more. The story of the Tudor secret is a story of what we are willing to believe for the sake of peace. It is a story of the masks we wear and the graves we dig. But most of all, it is a story of the enduring power of a lie. Sleep now with the knowledge that the past is a labyrinth and some paths are meant to lead to nowhere. The truth is buried, but the legend is immortal. Sleep now. The file is closed.